If you have a legacy project running PHP 5 and you want to upgrade it to PHP 7, then this video is for you. We will go through the backward and compatible changes introduced by PHP 7. Those are the changes that you should be absolutely fixing, as your code will no longer behave the same anymore, and it will very probably break. Then we will go through the new exciting features of PHP 7 that you might be using in your new upgraded version of your code. So let's get started. What we have here is a project that I have created that contains two folders. The first folder will be containing the backward and compatible changes, and the second folder will be containing the new features of PHP 7. I have created two Docker containers with Docker Compose thanks to this Docker Compose file over here. The first container will be having PHP 5.6 CLI as image, and the second one will be having PHP 7, which will allow us to run our code in two versions of PHP. The first one will be the legacy version of PHP, which is 5.6, and then the new version of PHP, which is 7.0. So if I execute PHP -v in my first container, I will be seeing 5.6, and then if I execute PHP -v in my second container, I'll be seeing PHP 7, which is good because we are going to be able to execute our code, especially for the first folder, in two versions of PHP, the 5 and the 7. Alright, so without further ado, let's go to the first change, which is error exception handling. In PHP 7, set exception handler is no longer guaranteed to receive exception objects. Why? Because so many errors have been converted into an error object in PHP 7. This error object is introduced in PHP 7 and doesn't exist in PHP 5. And if we trigger an error, we are going to have error passed here to our handler instead of exception, and that itself will trigger an error saying that the argument passed to handler is of type error and not exception. And that's what exactly I'm going to do over here. I'm going to try to dump 0 modulo 0, which will trigger a division by 0 error, and therefore our handler will not be able to execute because we are going to receive an error class instead of exception. So if I execute this in PHP 7, so let's do that, PHP and then the file name, which is error exception handling PHP. I'm going to get a fatal uncaught type error that says basically argument 1 passed to handler must be of instance exception, but it is getting division by 0 error. So the way to fix this, and by the way, if we execute this in PHP 5, we are not going to have this problem. We are simply going to have a warning and not an exception. So let's go back to PHP 7. The way to fix this is to either annotate this with throwable, which is a fix for PHP 7 only. If you want our code to work in PHP 5 and 6, we have to simply eliminate this type hinting over here. But if you want this to work in PHP 7, we simply have to annotate this with throwable. Why? Because the division by 0 error is an error that extends arithmetic error, which is by its turn extends error, and this error implements throwable. So we have as base class over here throwable. The same goes for exception. If I go and inspect exception, I will see that it implements throwable as well. So we can use throwable as base class for errors and exception. And that way we are guaranteed to have an instance of throwable whether we have an exception or an error. So this is the first change for PHP 7. The second change introduced in PHP 7 is for variable handling. Say that we have an associative array called foo that contains bar, bars as keys, and then foo bar bars as value. And then we have a second variable called foo bar bars, which will contains the string PHP 5. If we echo foo bar bars, we are going to have foo bar bars as a string, and then if we echo $2 foo bar bars, we are going to have PHP 5. This in PHP 5.6. Why? Because for PHP 5.6, the evaluation of this variable over here will be done from right to left. So this part over here will be equivalent to foo bar bars, and then we are going to echo foo bar bus simply with PHP 5. So let's test this code in PHP 5.6. If I execute PHP variable handling.php, I'm going to have foo bar bus at the first echo over here, and then PHP 5 as the second echo. Now if I execute this in PHP 7, that won't work. Why? Because the evaluation will be from left to right. So we are going to evaluate $2 foo and then bar bus, which does not make sense in this example over here. So this echo over here basically is not going to work. So let's try this. PHP to variable handling. The first echo is working because it makes sense even in PHP 7, but the second echo is not working. Now let's comment this out and see an example that will be working in PHP 7 to illustrate the evaluation of variables from left to right instead of right to left. So I have this foo variable that will be containing x as string, and then we have x variable that will be containing an associative array containing bar, bus, and foo bar bus. If I evaluate in PHP 7 this variable over here, $foo bar bus, I will be having it evaluated from left to right, which means that we are going to have $foo evaluated first, which translates to variable x, and then within that x we are going to try to access bar bus. So this echo over here is going to display foo bar bus for us in PHP 7. Let's try that out. It does display foo bar bus, which means that this variable expression is evaluated from left to right. Now if we have a PHP 5 legacy code and we want it to work in PHP 7, we simply have to use curly braces to make the evaluation of the expression explicit. The third change will be concerning the list function. If I execute this code over here in PHP 5.6, which seems to initiate 1, 2, 3 into an array, we are going to see an interesting thing. Let's execute this code, 3 list, and I'm executing it in PHP 5.6. I'm going to say the order of array is inverted. I'm going to have 3, 2, 1 assigned, although I set 1, 2, 3 in my array, which is kind of a weird thing in PHP 5 that got fixed in PHP 7. So if I re-execute the same code in PHP 7, PHP 3 list, I'm going to see 1, 2, 3, which does make sense actually. The second change for lists is that for PHP 5.6, initiating an empty list like this using list without argument is allowed. So if I execute this in PHP 5, I'm not going to get an error, but for PHP 7 I'm going to get an error saying that lists, fatal error, cannot use empty list in line 6. So this definition over here is no longer allowed in PHP 7. And the final change is that for 5.6 version of PHP, list used to implicitly call str_split if you want to explode a string into a list of characters. Say for example here that we want to have the first character of hello. We can use this in PHP 5.6 list, and we pass it a variable called h, for example, which will be equals to string, and within the list call itself we are going to have str_split call. So in PHP 5.6 we are going to have h variable equals h, which is the first character of hello world. Now if we execute this in PHP 7, we are not going to have that. We are going to have null. Why? Because list will no longer execute str_split. If we want to have the same behavior, we have just to execute str_split on the string before calling the list. So now if we execute again our code, we are going to have h. So this is the third change for PHP 7. Now the fourth one will be concerning the for each loop. Now for each in PHP 5 has some dark magic effects, especially if we change the array that we are for eaching over within the loop itself. So the first change made by PHP 7 is that when we iterate over the array, the internal pointer is no longer changed, meaning that when we do a for each on an array and we display the current, which will display for us the internal pointer of the array, it will always have the same value for PHP 7. But for PHP 5, it will increment each time. So let's test this code over here. If I do PHP and then for each.php, here I'm doping the current value of array, which should show me 0, then we should get 1, 2, and finally we should get false, meaning that we have finished iterating over the array. So if I execute this, I'm having 0, 1, 2, and finally false, which makes sense for PHP 5. Now for PHP 7, I should be getting always 0, which means that the internal pointer will never change. So let's execute again with for each.php, and here, as we expected, we are having 0, 0, 0, 0, means that the internal pointer has never changed, which is consistent for PHP 7 because it does cause a lot of problems for PHP 5. Now the second change for each is that if we change the array in the for each loop, we are going to have that change considered in the for each itself. Let me illustrate that with an example. Say that we have an array contains a single element that contains the integer 0. If I print this array over here, I'm going to have an array with a single element which is 0. Then I'm for eaching on this array, trying to echo the value of each item. I will echo 0 in the first iteration, then I'm going to set the second element of array as 1. But this one is not going to be echoed in PHP 5.6 because the for each will not be aware that there is a change made to this array. Let's execute this to verify. So our display would be from this line over here. Here we are displaying the array, which is this printr over here. Then we are echoing the value of our array, which is 0, but the 1 is not displayed. Why? Because in PHP 5.6 this change is not taken in consideration. So, and the final printr will show me the array, which is actually get updated, which means that the array contains 2 elements, but within the for each we were not able to reach this second element over here, which gets fixed in PHP 7. So if we execute the same code again in PHP 7, we are going to see the first display over here, which is the same as PHP 5, which contains a single element of our array. Then the echo will display 0, and then it will display the 1. So within the for each, we are aware that our array has changed, and then we have done a second iteration to echo the second value, which is 1, which is good because that made a lot of problems also for PHP 5.6. So this is for the for each part. Now let's go to functions. For functions, we have 2 changes have made in PHP 7. The first one is that the funcGetArg callback along with funcGetArgs with s and then debug backtrace, when getting the arguments that are passed to our function, they get the updated version of the arguments, which means that if we do a change in this argument within our function, we are going to get the argument with the change made to it. Let's see this in example. Let's say that we have a inc function which will increment the value of x and return it. Now in PHP 5.6, if I echo the value of argument at position 0, which is x, although I have incremented it in my function, I'm going to get 0 if I call it with 0. So let's try this out. PHP 5 function PHP, and I'm getting x equals to 0, although I have incremented the value of x in my function. This has been fixed in PHP 7. If I execute PHP 5 function.php, I'm going to get x equals to 1, which is consistent. Now the second change is that in PHP 7 we no longer are allowed to use 2 arguments with the same name. This was allowed in PHP 5.6. If I execute my code over here, I'm going to get PHP 5.6 saying nothing. Basically, it's not complaining about me having two arguments with the same name. But if I do execute the same code in PHP 7, I'm going to have a fatal error. Redefinition of parameter unused in line 16 is not allowed. That's for the functions. Now another improvement have been made for the static call context. Say that we have a class called A. Within this class we are going to have a function called test that will be dumping this special variable. This is not a static function, but within class B we are going to call a double dots test, which means that we are going to call test in a static context, although test is not a static function. This code will work in 5.6 without complaining. So if I execute PHP 6 static call context, I'm going to have a deprecated notice, but the code will work, and the var dump will be displaying the object B. Now if I execute the same code in PHP 7, I'm going to have a null for the var dump, and I'm going to have another notice that this variable is not defined in line 4. The final change that has been made is for strings. Let's execute this code over here in PHP 5.6 and see its output. Then let's comment on it. So if I execute PHP strings.php, what we have here, I am dumping whether this string equals 291, which is displaying true for me in PHP 5.6. Why? Because in PHP 5, each string that starts with 0x is considered as an hexadecimal notation, and it is considered as integer. So if I dump this hexadecimal notation equals the integer notation, it will show me true. It will show me also that this value is numeric, although it's a string. It will show me also that if I add 14 in hexadecimal notation with 2, it will show me 16. And if I sub str from foo, starting from the offset 1, which is in hexadecimal notation, it will work in 5.6, and it will show me 00. So that's interesting. Now if I execute this in PHP 7, all this will not work. So in PHP 7 we are not considering strings that start with 0x as hexadecimal integers, and we are going to have false for the first var dump, the second also false, the addition will not work, and I will be getting 0, and the sub str will also not work, and I'm going to have foo entirely. So the question will be, if I have this code working in PHP 5, how do I get that converted in PHP 7? Then the answer is in this block of code over here. Say that we have 0xf, which is 15 in hexadecimal notation. If you want to convert this into an integer value of 15, we simply use filter var callback. So here we are converting the str into integer using the filter var function, passing it as second argument filter validate integer to see that, to check if this notation over here is valid, and then as option we are allowing the hexadecimal notation. If this value is not integer, we are going to throw an exception, otherwise we are going to dump this integer. Let's try this code in PHP 7, and we are going to have 15. So those are the main changes that have been introduced in PHP 7 that will break your code in PHP 5. Now in the second part of the video, we are going to see the new exciting features of PHP 7, and there will be 10 features. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.